History remembers Chernobyl as an explosion, a burning reactor, a radioactive cloud that spread across Europe, and a city that was never the same again. But none of those images show where the disaster actually began. Not the fire, not the explosion, not even the moment radiation escaped the reactor. The real beginning happened earlier, at 1:23 in the morning. Inside a control room that looked completely ordinary. Nothing felt unusual. No alarms. No panic. No warning that history was about to change. A group of engineers were completing a safety procedure. A test designed to make the reactor safer. A system check meant to improve reliability. Everything followed procedure. Everything looked correct. And then, a single action was taken. A button was pressed. A system designed to prevent disaster was activated, and within seconds, something went wrong in a way no one expected. But here is the truth that makes Chernobyl different from most disasters. There was no single mistake, no single failure, no single moment of stupidity. Chernobyl was the result of something far more dangerous, a system that behaved normally, until it didn't. Tonight we reconstruct the final hours before reactor number 4 collapsed. Not to blame individuals, but to understand how intelligent people, following normal procedures, ended up inside one of the most extreme industrial disasters in history, and why this pattern still matters today, more than most people realize. Chapter 1: The Test That Should Have Been Simple. April 25, 1986. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was operating like any large industrial facility. Electricity was being generated. Systems were monitored. Everything appeared stable. That day, engineers were preparing a safety test. A simple question. If external power suddenly failed, could the turbine continue producing electricity long enough to bridge the gap before backup generators started? This was not experimental. It was routine engineering verification, a standard procedure. But in complex systems, nothing is ever truly simple. Earlier that day, something changed. The electrical grid demanded more power. The reactor could not be shut down on schedule. The test was delayed, then delayed again. By the time the night shift arrived, they were not starting from a controlled situation. They were inheriting one. And this is one of the most overlooked realities in engineering systems. No operator starts from zero. Everyone inherits the decisions made before them. And that night, those inherited conditions would matter more than anyone understood. From the control room, nothing seemed alarming. The instruments worked. The system responded. Everything appeared normal. But underneath that normal appearance, the reactor was entering a condition it was not designed to handle. Quietly, without obvious signals. And that is where most real-world disasters begin. Not with danger, but with normality that hides complexity. Chapter 2: The reactor starts to lose stability. As power levels were reduced, the reactor began to behave unexpectedly. Output dropped too far, lower than intended. Inside the core, a gas called xenon 135 began to accumulate. Xenon absorbs neutrons. It slows the nuclear reaction. This created a feedback loop. Lower power produced more xenon. More xenon reduced power further. To compensate, operators withdrew control rods, gradually increasing reactivity, restoring balance. At first it worked. The reactor stabilized. Power returned. The system appeared under control again. But what looked like recovery was actually a trade. Safety margins were being reduced. Quietly. Incrementally. And this is where intuition begins to fail. Because in complex systems, stability is not always visible. Sometimes systems look stable, while moving closer to instability. At this stage, the reactor was still operating, but it was no longer operating safely, and no instrument clearly showed how close it was to the end. This is one of the most dangerous characteristics of complex engineering systems. They do not fail loudly. They fail invisibly, until the moment they no longer fail quietly at all. Chapter 3: 1:23 am. At 1:23 in the morning, the safety test began. Steam flow was adjusted. Turbine conditions changed. The experiment entered its final phase. From the control room, everything still appeared controlled. No emergency signals. No panic. Only procedure. Then came the command. AZ-5. Emergency shutdown. The intention was simple. Insert all control rods. Stop the nuclear reaction. Bring the reactor to a safe state. On paper, this was the safest possible action. But the RBMK reactor had a hidden design characteristic, one that was not obvious during normal operation. As control rods entered the core, their graphite tips temporarily displaced coolant, and for a brief moment, this increased reactivity instead of decreasing it. Under normal conditions, this effect was harmless, but at that moment, the reactor was no longer normal. Power surged, rapidly, beyond safe limits, beyond design expectations, and suddenly, the shutdown system was no longer controlling the reactor. It was interacting with an unstable system, and that interaction was enough to change everything. Chapter 4, 6 seconds OF collapse. The reactor did not explode immediately. It escalated. Pressure inside the core increased faster than it could be released. Water turned into steam almost instantly, expanding violently inside confined structures. Fuel channels began to fail, one by one. At this point, the system crossed a boundary, a point where control systems no longer matter. Only physics remains. Within seconds, the reactor transitioned from controlled operation to uncontrolled energy release. 2 explosions followed, not as a single instant, but as cascading structural failure. The reactor building was severely damaged. The core was exposed, and radioactive material began to escape. But even then, the full situation was not immediately understood. Inside the control room, operators were still interpreting instruments that no longer reflected reality. Because in complex failures, understanding always lags behind events, and that delay can define the scale of disaster. Chapter 5, the human factor. After the explosion, attention eventually turned to responsibility, to decisions, to individuals. But modern analysis looks deeper. It asks a different question. Not who failed, but why failure was possible at all. Because the operators were not acting in chaos. They were following procedure. Within a system that had limitations they were not fully aware of. And that distinction matters. In complex systems, humans do not operate in isolation. They operate inside structures, inside constraints, inside assumptions built long before they arrive. And those assumptions define behavior more than intention ever could. Chernobyl was not simply a nuclear accident. It was a systems accident. A moment where design, pressure, and human decision-making aligned in an unintended way. And that is why it still matters today. Because the same pattern exists everywhere. In aviation, in medicine, in software systems, in energy grids, in financial systems. All of them share the same truth. They work until the conditions change in ways they were not designed for. And when that happens, failure does not arrive slowly. It arrives all at once. Chernobyl is not just history. It is a warning about complexity itself. Because the most dangerous systems are not the ones that look unstable. They are the ones that look completely normal, right up until the moment they fail. And that is the real lesson of 123M. Not a single decision, but a system that allowed that decision to exist. And once that is understood, Chernobyl stops being only a tragedy of the past and becomes a mirror for the present.